In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we find there the account of David and Goliath, and a loved account that we have all known since we were very young. And we often hear devotionals and sermons about defeating our giants today with God's help. And that's a legitimate lesson from that passage, I suppose. There's another lesson that I'd like to draw from that this morning. Bethlehem was about 16 miles away from Socho, which is the place where the Philistines were encamped, and the Israelites were also there encamped, standing across a valley from each other, waiting for war. And they were encamped in a place called Ephes Damim, which means the boundary of blood. Sounds like a nice place for a vacation, right? And it was clearly a place where the Philistines and the Israelites constantly met in battle, and it was their boundary line. And if you crossed that boundary line, you could expect bloodshed, something along those lines, I'm sure. So the Philistines are encamped along the southern hill, and then there's a valley, and on the kind of northeastern hill, the Israelites are encamped. And there's about a half a mile valley between the two of them, just enough distance to hear the booming noise of a giant's voice through the dry, hot air. And in verse 11 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And that kind of sets the tone for what's going to happen in this whole account. There's this giant, there's war happening, there's the king of God's people, just as afraid as the rest of the people. And that helps us set up what's about to happen with David, and we know the story well. Let's turn to 1 Samuel 17, and this is 17:12 through 18. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judea, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. That's Jesse we're talking about. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of these 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and the next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward and took his stand morning and evening. Jesse said to David, his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain, and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also, take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token of them." You may remember a few months back we had a devotional on biblical numbers and their meanings. And what was it that 40 represented? 40 days or 40 years, you remember? It was always a period of trial or a period of preparation for some event. You think about the flood and how many days and nights that it rained. It was 40. You think about Abraham in the wilderness and then in the desert, 40 years. And you think about the wilderness wandering, happened for 40 years. Jonah, how many days did he preach in Nineveh? 40 days. And then God will destroy Nineveh. So this period of 40, as we have talked about before, is a period of testing, a period of trial to see if something is going to take place. And it's a period also sometimes of preparation for the right thing to take place. And you see that throughout the scriptures, both old and new. These 40 days here in 1 Samuel 17 represented an opportunity for God's people, specifically King Saul as the leader of God's people, to show his faith and trust in God and to overcome God's enemies. Saul ended up not being the man God needed him to be. He looked the part, but he was only acting. Let's keep reading. This is 1 Samuel 17:19, and we'll read through 27. Now Saul and all of the other men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle against each army. And David left his things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. All the men of Israel saw the men They fled from before him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make the father's house free in Israel, so no tax." David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So here goes David with his cheese in hand up to the encampment. It is the 41st day, and David makes the 5-hour trek in the sun, and he comes to the forefront of the battle. And there Goliath is making his insult and his contest. And the only difference this day is that David heard him, verse 23. And that's the only thing that made the difference. There were other men there, or there were other boys there, but David ended up being the man that God needed him to be. 40 days of testing was up, and there was no one found to do God's will, to trust in him. So God sent somebody who would. And here's the interesting thing. David left as a shepherd boy with cheese, and he never made it home because God was going to make him the king. So the question and the lesson is, what about the cheese? What about those 10 pieces of cheese that were to be brought to the commander? This mundane and ordinary job that David was given ended up only being an opportunity for David to stand up and do God's will. It was just a conduit. His ordinary, everyday task ended up being the very thing that God needed him to do to get him where God wanted him to be. What we think is going to happen today, what we may think is happening with our lives, may be the very opposite of what God actually has in store for us. Do you believe that? It's very easy to become faithless. It's very easy to question that. Challenge that mindset. Because remember, God already had a king, and his name was Saul. He had the good looks and the size and the stature, the armor, and all of the money to go with it. But Saul did not do what God needed done. God didn't use the faithless Saul. He used a shepherd boy, a small, red-headed, cheese-smelling shepherd boy, because it was his trust in God. It was his heart of faith that was the giant slayer. It wasn't the size of his arm or the strength of his shield. We as God's people have to have this kind of immediate faith. What do I mean by immediate faith? You know, we have all had, as David puts it, those situations where we have come up against the paw of the lion or the paw of the bear, and we really didn't know how we were going to deal with those things. But God carried us through, and we trusted in God, and we overcame those things that by ourselves we could not have done. And so looking back on those things, we now have the faith to come up against the giants in our lives and be ready for the moment, just like David was. So what about the cheese? David's job started as delivery of cheese and ended up being delivery of God's people, because he was the man, while Saul and all the rest of those men who were dressed for war actually weren't ready for war. David, who was dressed like a shepherd, was ready for what God needed him to do. And you know what? David didn't know that, but he was ready for it. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving Christ, Colossians 3:23 and 24. David has worked all of his life, trusting in God, living for God, working for God. When Hezekiah realized that they were living incorrectly as God's people, and he found the scroll of the Lord, and he was making all of these reforms in Judah, this is what the text says that Hezekiah did. Thus Hezekiah did through all Judah, and he did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God, and every work that he undertook in the service of the house of God and in accordance with the law and the commandments, seeking his God, he did with all of his heart, and he prospered. 2 Chronicles 31:20 and 21. We have to live our lives as Christians, working for the Lord with all of our hearts, trusting in his care and providence, and being ready to stand up and be the one that God needs us to be at any given moment, in any given situation. And we may not even know what it is. We may be delivering the cheese and end up delivering God's will in somebody's life. You know, you don't have to be the one that everyone expects. You just have to be the one that's willing to do God's will at any cost and defend his name. And if you do, you will prosper. Have a great weekend. God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you Sunday.